Hello, everybody, and welcome to another discussion on Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of world history. And we are still making our way through ancient India. It's it's been a slightly slower plod, but we're getting there. And today we've reached the ethereal spheres of Hindu religion and mythology and the religious sphere, as Hegel, or as the editors of this edition call it. So we'll be talking about how Hegel conceptualizes Hindu religion and how it falls within his general conception of ancient India.
And which in turn falls into his general conception of world history. But
Right, yeah.
We'll get to that towards the end of this section.
Exactly.
Indeed, we are starting the so-called religious sphere today. And I feel like that's been on the forefront of this entire chapter. There's never been ancient India without any sort of religious or mythological thinking right from the outset.
Mm.
But I guess this time we're going to now focus in on that element and isolate it on its own and see if there's any conceptual or speculative insights we can extract from that.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess the interesting question that Hegel raises near the beginning of this discussion is in the second paragraph, where he asks, how are people so devoid of spiritual substantiality? And we'll get to what that means, what Hegel means by spiritual substantiality. How people devoid of that, of independence, can themselves become conscious of the higher life, of what is truly substantial. So Hegel is sort of perplexed, or rather, he's sort of perplexing us by putting forth this seeming paradox that on the one hand we have a people who seem to be devoid of spiritual substantiality, and yet on the other hand are able to be conscious of what is truly substantial.
Mm-hmm.
How is it they have both? And I think a large part of this chapter is Hegel's answer to that sort of question.
Yeah.
This sort of dual aspect of the Hindu religious sphere.
Yeah. First of all, I guess we should remark that this is pretty harsh stuff, once again, from Hegel. He doesn't give any quarters to ancient India, devoid of spiritual substantiality.
Just empty.
That is just rough, man. Yeah.
It is
And
rough. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and
It's it when I was one of the things. I mean, I don't want to jump ahead too much. I'll bring it up later when we get to it.
okay. But so let's so I have a overall comment about that whole sentence, but I thought it'd be good to unpack just what is meant by spiritual substantiality here.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
What do you think it is about?
So from what he says in the rest of this section, the sort of because he's constantly comparing Christianity with, or a kind of Christianity that he sort of likes, with Hinduism. And from what I understand, what he means by spiritual substantiality, which he seems to recognize in his particular brand of Christianity, is the self-conscious sort of recognition, self-conscious self-relation with oneself. To put it in religious terms, it is sort of the identification of the divine with the human, of not thinking that there is this distance.
Careful.
Am I being
Careful. Yeah,
yeah, go
but
on.
well, the issue there is if you collapse the two together, that's exactly the thing that Hegel's going to be critiquing the Indians for doing in this section, right? Because he thinks,
Sure.
there is no natural world for the Indians because the spiritual and natural just always diffusely combined.
Yeah, but his particular criticism, though, is that they elevate the natural to the level of spirit, right? It's because they they see the divine in every aspect of nature. So he gives the example of the way they treat the sun, the way they treat sort of streams or mountains.
Yeah.
And one of his criticisms seems to be that the problem is the elevation, the recognition of the divine in nature rather than the recognition of the divine in spirit proper.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes, well, that's the big question. Just what is spirit proper, right?
So, for example,
So we'll get into the criticisms Hegel makes about nature and spirit regarding the Hindu religion, but I just wanted to point out from what you were saying, it didn't seem to be a good enough distinction, right? Just this nature and spirits together, because we need something more more elaborate than that, I think.
Right. Okay. So what do you think it is?
So I would lean on the second little clause that Hegel adds of independence, which once again suggests to me that, well, this is just about freedom once again. That they're devoid of spiritual substantiality because they don't see their own thought as being the root cause and agent and source of activity in the world. They think it's somewhere out there, whether that be nature or beyond nature in some abstract realm, but they are not reflecting this back on thought, and therefore it's kind of becomes detached. Like they don't, it becomes incoherent basically.
Okay, isn't that, but that seems to be, and so when I said that it's about recognizing or making explicit what it is for them to be self-conscious, isn't that implicitly this idea about them recognizing the divinity in thought?
Yeah.
No?
So I agree with you with the first thing you're saying, recognizing the self-consciousness and so on. But they cannot stop with saying the divinity in thought, because you still have to deal with nature and embodiment somehow.
Okay.
Otherwise, it seems like you're just making a new abstraction, the same kind of abstraction, just a different place.
Okay, so that's okay then. So then is there some kind of speculative understanding of how the spiritual and the material coexist?
I suppose so. It must be like that, don't you think?
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, I would say that's right. I mean, also in the next sentence, right, he talks about how the Hindu notion of absolute substance is a subsistence in which both the spiritual and the material aspects are annihilated.
Yes.
So that would sort of speak to the kind of distinction you were just trying to prompt now about having a speculative understanding of the spiritual and the material.
Yes, which seems to require that you keep them apart. You understand there's something special about each, such that you cannot just transfer one over into the other, right?
Yeah.
So according to give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and God to what is God, right? Or however it's being said, right? Basically, you keep the distinction, but recognize there also a kind of mediation between them.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah, right. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. And this is something that Hegel is going to pick on a lot in this chapter, right? This idea that the spiritual and the material are annihilated, the sort of negative relation that the Hindus are supposed to have towards the divine.
It is also opening up for a kind of unrestricted superstition, right?
Yeah, I think we spoke
in
about this earlier. Yeah,
in the ordinary sense of like, well, you can say anything about anything. There is no really criterions or any kind of way of establishing anything
yeah,
scientifically or truthfully.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
He talks about how nothing is secure.
Mm-hmm.
That because everything is just transitory, everything is just this movement. There is no sort of substantial one in the sense that we've been talking about it. And then he says specifically that it's indeterminate and it's self-dissolving. So this idea that you can't focus on this one, on the actual substance of the divine, that it's always sort of somewhere else.
Well, you are focusing on the one and the absolute substance, but at the cost of removing everything else, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But also because of the sort of the pantheistic aspect of it, whenever you're focusing on something, it is never wholly it. It can also be something else. There is also something else in nature that is also representative of the one.
Yeah, well, sure, but you can just say, well, that's representative of the one, not the one that's proper.
Yeah, but isn't that part of the indeterminacy though? That what the one is constantly passing over into different possible representations.
Yes and no, because none of the representation can capture the one, and so the one must be the void or be void, right? Because you cannot determine it.
Because you can't determine it, right? Okay, so you've got sort of this, and we've actually nicely arrived at this back and forth that Hegel himself arrives at. That on the one hand, it's these sort of determinate representations of what it is, and then immediately it vanishes into this void, this nothingness, this abstraction.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's these two extremes, right? Either you collapse natural and spiritual into all determinacies, or it just becomes the other way where you just have total indeterminacy.
Yeah.
Total indeterminacy, ultra determinacy on the other. No mediation or middle ground, anything like that. Yeah.
Just to quote then, when Hegel begins to talk about this on page 276, he says that Hindu religion is but a giddy whirl from one extreme to the other. We also find in it an ascent to what is most abstract. Sorry, that's before that where he talks about it. Oh, it's a bit earlier. It's page 274. He says, we see two sorts of aspects since the struggle of their dreaming. Remember, he talks about India as the land of dreaming, is a buzzing about from one extreme to the other. One is the representing of the object, the other, the consciousness that strives to raise itself up to the essentiality of the object. And that striving to raise itself to the essentiality is that moment of abstraction, which then falls into void, into sort of nothingness.
Yeah. But I want us to return to this initial sentence and just explore a little bit this why Hegel's this hits like a puzzling question, right? Because one should expect that nothing significant will come from this, right? Because of these extremes, these incoherence, this mere dreaming, this overflow of subjectivity. You would think that, well, why is there anything significant happening here? Well, there is significant stuff happening here. They can, like, how people so devoid of spiritual substantiality, according to Hegel, can themselves become conscious of the highest life, of what is truly substantial. So I'm reading that as to mean that, well, despite all this lack and failures and shortcomings, there is nonetheless a real kernel of truth here and substantiality. That must be the case.
Yeah.
And this suggests to me that, never mind ancient India, we might also think of this as, well, wherever there is thinking, wherever there is concepts, wherever there are self-conscious beings, they will develop religiosity, religious feelings, religion, religious knowledge, such that they will try to make sense of their place in the world in terms of a world, in terms of the whole, in terms of the universal.
Yeah.
Right? And that will have to be negotiated through various representations, determinations, etc., which then leads to the second issue of, well, how does the determinate, which is particular, relate to this wholeness, which is universal, right? This is what, right. All religions have to give some sort of answer to this.
Mm-hmm.
And here in ancient India, we are at a very immediate stage where we seem to have more elements at play than we had in ancient China. And the fact that we have more elements, we can develop these extremes, but we are not able within this context to make sense of those things as extremes, as moments of a higher order concept. It seems like ancient Indian religion here is in the mode of one or the other, but doesn't see that they have these two modes, at least not really conscious of it.
Yeah, I think that's right, because if they were conscious of it, then there would be some kind of speculative unity of these modes. That would be the becoming self-conscious.
Yes.
That Hegel thinks is missing.
Yeah.
I think you're very right to point out that wherever that Hegel's philosophy implies this idea that so long as you have self-conscious beings, maybe a state is important, I'm not sure, but as long as you have self-conscious beings, that there's always going to be this kernel of truth in what they're doing, but it's not going to be fully explicit to themselves or fully explicit in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's, and it's true. And what's exciting for Hegel about ancient India as opposed to ancient China is that despite the fact that it's not explicit to themselves, that they are treating the concepts here of the spiritual and material, let's say, in a more developed way than we saw in ancient China.
Yeah.
And that's sort of, I guess that's what brings them closer to the truth of the matter.
Yes, if only to bring out the inherent problems, right? Like there is, the extremes are not in and for themselves good, but they're good insofar as they can be steps towards a higher concept or recognition.
Exactly. Yeah.
But what seems to be occurring in the text is that, despite this only like lack of explicit knowledge about what's going on, there is nonetheless speculative intimations of that kind of concrete unity, which we see in the stories that are being told.
Yeah.
So it's like even though the structure of the religion is kind of I don't know how to say it. It's oppositional and incoherent. It has within itself the means to transcend that structure.
Yeah. Do you think we should understand that as an expression of the self-development of thought? That thought is not sort of rigidly contained within the structures that it finds itself, such as this opposition within within ancient Hindu religious thinking.
Yeah.
But because of its sort of self-developmental character, it can find its expression within the sphere in ways that, or in different ways, such as in these variety of myths.
Yeah. But I suppose that at one point, the structure is going to prevent the myths from developing further, right? Because that's the language and grammar of the story.
Although, or the fact that the myths exist will be almost like the seed for the development of further for the development of thought. The fact that you have these, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that you have myths of a religious sphere that are conceptually in tension with that religious sphere, or conceptually more developed than the religious sphere in which they are born and sort of cradled.
Yeah.
And the point could be made, perhaps, that there is this, that thought will, the people that think these myths, the people that come up with these myths are sort of the development of thought that hasn't fully made explicit to itself what it's developed. They're finding ways to conceptualize this, what is given to them as an opposition in a slightly more conceptually sophisticated form.
Yeah.
But they themselves are not yet fully conscious of what they've done with this new formulation.
Yeah. Well, it is in a strange way, like there's always some sort of quasi-history building in religions, right? A creation myth, right? Because it's insofar as we're trying to make sense of the singular, particular, and the universal, those kind of, through the religious lens, the form that takes is predominantly through a creation story, right? Where you get a sense of how things come and how they pass and how they are maintained, etc., right? But this is always viewed in some eternal past, distant past. And the only way for that to maintain itself in the religious structure is for the religious structure to remain static. The people of the structure have to always look back on a distant past, but they cannot see themselves as part of that past, if you see what I mean. It's only once you get successive generations, people squabbling about what's in that distant past, that you start to get a new past emerging in the near, the present past or the real historical past, about people arguing of what was really the distant past, and you have these different schools and groups, etc.
And that's the expression of the development of thought.
Well, it's a little bit more explicit expression, because you're taking into account that the stories themselves might have developed through time, that they weren't just dropped out of the sky at one point in time, right? That you gain the sense of like, well, this is how we view things now, and we viewed things differently before. But in a young religion or young culture, it seems like there isn't this sense of a history where our sense of who we are has changed over time, but it's just something that we are just here now, and there's a distant past of which we immediately relate to. So anyway, I think we should move to focus on these extremes that Hegel outlines. What do you think?
Yep.
Yeah.
I think that sounds good. Yeah. So the first extreme is he calls it the sensuality of Hindu religion, the fact that it is a religion of nature, that it directly reveres natural objects as divinity, and that human beings relate themselves to these natural objects as they relate themselves to their own essential being.
Yes.
And this is just a really interesting way to, I just thought this was a very interesting way to conceptualize this kind of religious thinking. This idea that by, I think in one of the first episodes in ancient India, we spoke about the sort of the radical subjectivization of objectivity that is going on there. And it's interesting when you think that through, you do come to this point that when you imbue the natural world with subjectivity, you are relating to it as if you're relating to another person or to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a distinct conceptual relation. It's a subtly different conceptual relation to relating to it as sheer objectivity, and it's subtly different to what we might think is the next one, which is relating to, let's say, divinity as a person. The way Christianity might relate to God as, or might conceptualize Christ, man, as divine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I found that to be a very insightful conceptual point about the implications of this particular kind of religion of nature, to quote Hegel.
Yeah.
What about you?
What stuck out to me was the fact that there makes no sense to talk about miracles in the Hindu worldview, because
all of creation
the
is a
divine,
miracle.
all of creation is miraculous, right? So he says they have no set natural law, and with no set natural law, you have no need for a additional conception of miracles as something outside of that natural law, right? So I thought that was interesting how it just collapses that. That those determinations.
I agree completely. And then he talks about the kind of respect they have for animals, which again, that was a really, really interesting point as well, because again, it follows. He gives the example of the city, which is inhabited by monkeys, in which people called fakirs serve them. And so again, you have this elevation of the natural to the spiritual, and people treat the natural as if it were spiritual, perhaps as even more as divine, maybe in some cases. So again, I found that an insightful conceptual point.
Yes, but it also cuts the other way, right? So if somebody is a cripple or poor or having a suffering or having a hard time, it's nothing divine about that, because they're probably living out the punishment from their previous life, which they did some bad stuff or whatever, right?
Yeah. So this brings us to the transmigration of souls.
That strikes one as really like abhorrent, right?
Yeah, right.
That is denigrating spirit. So you have elevation of spirit in animals, nature, and so on, which one can be charitable towards that, but not so charitable towards the denigration of spirit into natural objects, or like explaining them away or giving some sort of justification, right? That is, I suppose, not dealing with the present.
It's kind of a, I don't know, the way you just put it, it reminded me of the indeterminacy that we were talking about earlier, because there seems to be something arbitrary about assigning an elevated position, let's say, to these monkeys in the city, and a uh, and a lower position to a cripple, I can see why. You can sort of make sense of it. A cripple is expressing these material deficiencies, uh, and so that might make you think something regarding how that regarding their spiritual, so the state of their spiritual being. But at the same time, there's something arbitrary because you could just as easily think, because there is nothing trying to put my finger on it. There doesn't seem to be a precise conceptual reason for why the monkeys should be elevated, whereas the cripples should be denigrated. That it has this feeling of indeterminacy, that that for whatever reason they are revered, and for whatever reason they are sort of feared or hated.
Yeah, or shunned. I'm sure
or shunned. Yeah.
I'm sure there is like a rationale behind these things, but I think for us Hegel, I think, points out a critique somewhere in the text here, that there is a confusion with regards to the emphasis on whether singularity is predominant or universality. Because in a world where universality is predominant, everything revolves around the one. So nothing has any real being, any significance. All substance is with the one. And so whatever you do as an individual shouldn't really matter. And so what you did in a previous life shouldn't really matter, because why are we even considering this kind of continuity of one individual to the next individual? Why bother? Because the one is the true, is the substantial true being. So,
and yet it does matter.
And yet it does matter. And so there seems to be a focus on, or emphasis on, singularity at the detriment of universality, or like de-emphasizing universality. And I think here is an ambiguity, right? Well, which way do you want to go? And it's the arbitrariness that, sometimes you go with the universal and other times you just go with the singular. Make it up as you go.
Right. Yeah.
Just as Charles I's trial.
He makes a nice point about the transmigration of souls, which he connects to the discussion we've been having now. And he talks about how we imagine, Christian 19th century Europe, imagines the soul as the consciousness of oneself. So this is my soul, the soul of Ahilleas, the soul of Filip, so on and so forth. Whereas Hegel makes the point that the Hindus represent the soul as being unaware of its previous condition. Yeah. So it doesn't have a particular personality. It's not he says there is no personal continuation of the soul. Yeah. It's not as if the soul of Filip is being drawn back as a toilet brush, as you almost certainly would be Filip. It's this, I guess it's almost like this indeterminacy, this sort of nothingness, this voidness. The soul is just a nondescript thing that moves from object to object.
But nonetheless, it carries with it a kind of history of what that individual did.
Yeah, exactly. Nevertheless, it carries the history, of their particular deeds and misdeeds.
So, it's what's the point with it then? Why not just forget about this continuity altogether and say, and you're just finite. This is it. No, there was no before, and there will be no after.
Yeah.
So for Plato,
I was just going to mention Plato. Yeah.
We always going to mention Plato. So it's not like for him as well that there is a kind of personality you're supposed to remember, but you're supposed to remember knowledge, categories, the truth, right? Because those things are within you already. You're just making it explicit for yourself. And that's what kind of philosophy is doing, helps you do.
Yeah,
But
that's what I wanted to say actually, because it's
but
interesting because the kind of criticism he levels here could also be leveled at Plato's conception of soul.
it could maybe, but I think not, because for Plato it seems like he's explicit about it being the knowledge of the universal that is retrieved, not the knowledge of singular particular, right? Whatever you did of actions and concrete things in a previous historical timely situation.
Yeah, but the criticism of the criticism that there is no personal continuation would be leveled on Plato.
But there is no personal continuation.
Yeah, there is no, yeah.
Well, then there's no criticism to be leveled because he doesn't need that to for his theory.
Plato doesn't know, but Hegel seems to value Hegel seems to be connecting explicit self-consciousness with this conceptualization of soul
Right.
as having some kind of personal uh being personally attributed to the material.
Yes.
That's the impression I'm getting from what he's writing here.
Yeah.
Um,
But
whereas,
he doesn't stipulate in a kind of crude Christian sense that of an afterlife where you maintain your personality despite of your disembodiment.
who doesn't stipulate?
I mean, does Hegel stipulate that here?
No, not here. No, he doesn't. I'm really
No.
just inferring it from the kind of stuff that he's saying.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, because he just makes the point of saying our soul has consciousness of its own self-identity, and
Yeah.
being conscious of your own self-identity sort of echoes the distinction between Christian religion and sort of explicit self-consciousness and Hindu religion, which is not aware of its own
Yeah. But
self-consciousness.
I wonder if when Hegel says that, you couldn't trace that back to Aristotle rather than Christianity.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know. Um, but that's why I thought about Plato's theory of recollection in this respect, because
Mm-hmm.
not yeah, you know what I mean, the whole sort of mythological fabric of it. Uh, because Plato sort of takes a step away from Homer, who has this very personal continuation of soul, where you actually have, you have the shades of individuals in the underworld, and he goes towards this more abstract conception of soul. Uh, but then he also does elevate, you might say, the value of he elevates the conception of spirit by tying it together with knowledge and truth rather than with uh, your individual deeds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think that's absolutely correct. Yeah, but I don't know. Yeah, that's the impression I get, that he's criticizing this more abstract conception of spirit.
Yeah. 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 Shall we move on?
Yeah, yeah,
But there's an interesting bit towards the end of page 176 where it seems to be like a little bit of a reference to the phenomenology of spirit on the unhappy consciousness section.
right. Yeah, do you want to talk
Because
about that?
just very briefly, so one of the ways in which, paradoxically, despite this suffusion of natural and divine together, there is also the opposite method of dealing with it, which is the complete separation of the two, which is what one finds in ascetic approaches. So, as Hegel writes, as devoid of freedom, Hindu self-consciousness lacks the inwardness to stand before God. Instead, it can only relate itself to God as negating itself within God. This absolute negating of oneself is the highest point of Hindu self-consciousness. this complete renunciation must then count as what is supreme. And this manifests itself not just in a kind of mental exercise, but also physical exercise.
Yeah. Yeah, he talks about all these sort of punishments and self-sacrifices that they put themselves through.
Yeah, and
In
self-surrender.
an effort to reach God.
Yeah.
Which reminds one of a lot of Christian ascetic practices as well, right?
Sure. Yeah. This is a popular thing throughout the history of religion.
Who were those? Was it a Russian sect or a Ukrainian sect that would castrate themselves?
Just to make sure,
Yeah.
I solemnly swear I'm up to no good.
Yeah, but you're going to talk about the connection with the unhappy consciousness, because Hegel connects this sort of, he calls it self-surrender, this negation of yourself. He says it's to be regarded as unhappiness.
Yes. Well, in the section on the phenomenology, what is kind of like, you could say crudely, is the cause of unhappiness is that you're pinned up against an unchangeable other, unchangeable universal, unchangeable world or situation. And part of the difficulty there is that your very self-consciousness is kind of at the root of generating this state, this duality, this opposition.
Okay.
Yeah. And the way then that self-consciousness kind of tries to deal with it is to bring in a sort of mediator to figure out this unchangeable other and you, which is completely changeable. But as we know with Hegel, as soon as we set these oppositions up, they flip around, because really you're the one who is completely unchangeable in this relationship, whereas the world out there and the other is what's in total flux. And
it's not me, it's you.
Yeah, exactly. It is me and you. Right. But then self-consciousness introduces a mediator, which is a third thing, and then that continues to develop up until reason is developed, which is kind of collapses this whole tension and static, like this opposition, and then brings into a whole new sort of different logic.
Okay.
But then that stops being one of self-consciousness, becomes one of reason.
So do you think there's something similar here? I mean, is there something unchanging? He doesn't put it in those terms.
No, he doesn't say. He doesn't put those terms at all. I'm just reading that in because of him just dropping unhappiness, and I know
it's not common for him to use that term.
No.
So it's definitely it's worth pointing out.
No, I don't think there is any development a way out of self-consciousness.
Okay.
In the phenomenology of spirits, that text's technical sense.
Yeah. Okay.
There are intimations of speculative insights, but they are confined within the stories, I think.
Okay.
They're only hints of something out.
So it's in this sort of opposition, in this it's in this abstraction that Hegel, I think, pinpoints the most positive aspect of Hindu religious thought, right? Because he says, in this proximity to the supreme point, the speculative echoes of representation emerge. Then he goes on to say that they are confused and obscure, but nevertheless, they're there. So in this abstraction, Hegel thinks that Hindu religious thought is getting close to grasping the true speculative nature of thought.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess this must go on, yeah.
Just very quickly, I guess we should highlight now that we've moved from the one extreme to the other.
Yes.
Because previously we were talking about sensuality and the physical and nature and divine put together. Now we are talking about the opposite extreme, which is them completely apart to the point where the whole thing becomes indeterminate.
Yeah, exactly. And as you said,
Please
he's kind
carry
of
on.
drawing on this ascetic idea of religion,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So when you deprive yourself of things, uh, both materially and not spiritually, but when you sort of I guess a crude way of putting it is when you just try to meditate on by not thinking of anything, let's say, as a way of getting to the core of being.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that Hegel sees in this abstraction the closest approach that Hindu religious thought comes to grasping being, the core of thinking. And I think it's this abstraction that he's sort of talking about, the fact that they're treating the material and the spiritual as abstracted from each other.
That's completely distinct.
I think this is what as completely distinct. Yeah. I think that's what he's pointing to as they're approaching a speculative understanding. Speculative echoes of representation emerge, but they don't fully grasp it. I don't know, what do you think?
I think the more speculative insight comes a little bit later once he starts talking about Krishna and Vishnu and Brahma and like all of them together. I think there you see more of a kind of speculative insight. What's happening here once we are separating nature and the divine and thinking about one is a step towards speculative insight, but it's kind of the essential turn you need to do in order to get to the speculative insight. It's the necessary mediation. It's like, okay, we regard nature and spirit together out in the world. Everything's determinate, happy bundle of joy, good. But I'm still unsatisfied. Why? Well, because this bundle of thing togetherness is not good. No, negate that. Do the complete other thing. Pull them apart. Pull them apart even more. Take away all the nature. Take away all the spirit. Leave indeterminacy.
Yeah. And so exactly. So as you said, so maybe we should just talk about, and this is just really the final few passages of this section where Hegel talks about Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and this speculative relationship they have.
Before we get there, I just want to latch onto a little very, very interesting little speculative move that happens between the difference that is made between Brahma and Brahman. So the way Hegel first makes sense of it is that one is Brahma, Brahman is the one. So there is a kind of definite article that is added to Brahman. So and that there is kind of more implicit negation at work in the one rather than just simply one.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like, if you think of things, crudely put, as one, it's all inclusive. But if you think of the one, well, it's the one as opposed to the many or the this or the that, right? So there's a kind of higher negative charge, so to speak, with the one.
Yeah, really good.
As he goes on to say, they say that this one is beyond all concept, beyond all understanding, is invisible, eternal, omnipotent, omnipresent. This one has no temple, no public worship. Human beings have no positive relation to it.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting, right? So here there is a kind of coherence with regards to how things are thought about and how they are practically exercised. So if you do have this idea of a negative, wholly negative one, the one, then you shouldn't really have any kind of representations or temples or any kind of worship, because what are you trying to represent or manifest or symbolize? You can't. And they don't do it, which is, it's aligned.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. Whereas Brahma as just one permits of other things to participate within it.
It seems like a more immediate unity, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's not yet thought of as the unity apart from the manifold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Really good, really important point. Yeah.
It's very juicy. I like it.
It is very juicy. Yeah.
Yeah.
He talks about that, doesn't he? He specifically discusses this.
Yeah, he says on page 277,
Yeah.
the whole stuff about not worshiping the one, because what are you going to worship? It's the
What are you
one.
going to worship? Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Just wanted to say something about that. Now we can go to the last point, I suppose, which is about Brahma, Vishnu, and Krishna.
Yeah. I guess a nice way to talk about it is to talk about the story of creation that he talks about.
Yeah.
On page 279, where the Almighty creates Brahma, so one, not the one. And he tells him to go and create the world, and Brahma's sort of uncertain as how to do it. And then he creates, Vishnu, but things don't sort of work out really well because there isn't a destructive element in the world yet, with just Vishnu and Brahma. And so he creates Shiva as the destroyer. And so you have this sort of cyclical movement of sort of creation and destruction, generation and corruption. And Hegel sees in this an echo of the speculative. Again, he says echo of the speculative, of an understanding, I guess, of the essential negativity in reality and in thought.
Yeah. So first of all, you have Brahma, who makes shapes, but then Hegel says Vishnu gave reality to Brahma as merely ideal things.
Yeah. They were possessed with nothing but reality, without knowledge or thought. They were idiots with fat bellies.
Yes. Of course. I mean, that succinctly expressed. I'm just trying to think about this. It's like the ideal comes first, then comes like the filling out of those idealities.
But as
that
sheer materiality.
Well, it's not even really real, because what's really real needs to have the element of destruction or nothingness or negativity part of it as well.
Yeah.
And that is how you can see, okay, we have beginning and ending and the transition from between the two. And therefore we have the basic elements of, the world metaphysics.
Yeah.
But I'm just trying to kind of map this onto Hegel's metaphysics, if it is even at all possible. Who is who here? Is Brahma being, Vishnu nothing, and then Shiva becoming? No, that doesn't seem right.
I think Vishnu is determinate being. And I think Brahma is being and nothing. And Shiva is becoming.
Yes. So maybe Brahma is being and Shiva is nothing. Vishnu is determinate being. So we don't have anything for becoming here. But in like, if we're gonna grossly graft this onto Hegel's ontology, we're doing gross injustice to both both sides here. But for the heck of it, let's see what comes out of it. The creation would be being, and destruction would be nothing. And then maintenance and determinacy, it would be determinate being.
And I guess what's interesting though is that Hegel says that Shiva unites both aspects.
Yes.
So Hegel seems to be conceptualizing Shiva as playing the role of moving from one to the other.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. So maybe Brahma is both being and nothing, but Shiva is becoming, because it's once you have Shiva in play, you get the destruction insofar as being passes over to nothing and nothing passes over into being. Both for being and nothing, respectively, each of them passing over into their other is a destruction of them. But then passing over is creation once more.
Yeah.
And then once you put the two together into a unity and stabilize that, you have a determinate being, and that is maintained because it contains this becoming within itself, and that's
the problem.
That's Vishnu.
This is the problem when you try to find when you're trying to map on representations to conceptual structures. It's just never as neat.
No, it's never.
I think that general broad outline, I think that's on the right track.
Well, whatever the representations are, what the representations are trying to express here is these notions of being, nothing, creation, destruction. How is there anything maintained at all, right? Because if something is maintained, it's not just simple being or creation as such, right?
Yeah.
It's not just like a switch that goes on and then it's maintained. No, it's something more complex. And that's, I think, what's the speculative echoes of this story is that it's drawing out those complexities within our ideas of creation and destruction and life.
100%, yeah. I think also the concept of change is quite important here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Shiva seems to be the one that explains how change happens. Because without Shiva, you just have idiots with fat bellies. I'm not entirely sure what exactly that's meant to mean, but the way I interpreted it is just some kind of like a rotting almost.
Yeah.
Like just pointless continuity of the same.
Yeah, being is being is being is being.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, Parmenidean being.
And Shiva is the one that's explaining how you get change. So yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So final point.
Yes. It has to do with the cultus.
Yeah, this is to do with the more practical.
Yeah. So up until now, we were thinking about, so just to recap, we talked about the first aspect, religion of nature. Now we're talking about the second aspect, about the more, let's say, representational or intellectual aspect of that. There is also the sort of material, physical aspect of this second aspect of abstraction. Yeah. And this is what Hegel is talking about here. He's talking about I suppose it makes sense that Hegel would want to talk about these two aspects within the second aspect that abstracts the spiritual from the material, because if they haven't fully made explicit the speculative nature of these two moments, then you're going to find in both of them ways of attaining to the one, to the spiritual. You're going to, because you might think, oh, they made this distinction, okay, they're going to sort of focus on the spiritual to attain the spiritual, right? Why, if you once you made the distinction, once you've extracted spirit from nature because you're dissatisfied with what you had before, well, why on earth would you continue to try and find the spiritual and the natural and the material and the physical? But that's exactly what they do, and it seems to me that that must be rooted in the fact that the speculative relationship of the spiritual and material, whilst abstracted, is not made explicit to themselves. It's they've made this distinction, but implicitly they're treating it as it was before.
Right.
You see what I'm trying to get at?
Not quite.
No. Okay, so the question is, right? Okay, so let's just begin from the question. Given that you were dissatisfied with the first aspect, and you resolve it by abstracting the spiritual from the material, why would you then try to strive for the spiritual through the material? Through self-sacrifice, punishment, what have you. Doesn't that suggest a certain degree of incoherence?
Yeah, why bother? Because it's the material, right? It shouldn't matter.
Right. It seems to me that the reason for why that is because they haven't made explicit to themselves the distinction that they've just drawn. So they're pulling them apart, but they're still treating it as if they were not pulled apart. They're still treating the material as if it's spiritual, and they're still treating or maybe not the spiritual as material, but they're definitely still treating the material as spiritual.
Yeah, I think what is being implied in self-sacrifice is that you're trying to change nature in order to attain pure spirit, to put it very crudely.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're doing that by simple negation, by sheer negation, right?
But you can only coherently think that if you think that there is something in the material that is spiritual.
Yes, this is what is being presupposed.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? But this is what is not made explicit. They just keep the two apart and don't realize that, well, in order to, you can never just negate something in being, let alone nature, because in negating it means also transforming it, altering it.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of training your body, you're training your habits, your emotions, your feelings, your thought patterns, etc., to attain to the spiritual existence. Even though the goal is not to train, the goal is just to attain spiritual existence. So that's the detach, the difference that is maintained.
That too, yeah.
But they are implying and presupposing that, well, the natural, as you say, must be spiritual, and the spiritual must itself be open to change and development. Otherwise, why bother the whole thing with nature, right? All of these sort of steps need to be implied.
Yeah.
But that is never kind of made explicit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
The way Hegel puts it, I think, in the text is that Hindu ascent then indeed breaks through the natural, but in such a way that natural existence cannot maintain itself at this peak, cannot make itself concrete, cannot fulfill itself.
Yeah. That's a really nice one.
Yeah.
That's really good. Natural existence cannot maintain itself at this peak. And that's because they've only attained it by negating it.
Exactly.
At the very point at which they are about to reach freedom,
Yes.
they are completely undermining themselves. They're preventing themselves from getting it because they're dead.
Well, because they negate everything.
Put crudely.
They negate everything to the point of also negating spirit, because you have to take away your own singularity and individuality if you are to be with the one.
So, yeah, and just to sort of echo what you're saying, Hegel says towards the bottom of the paragraph on page 280, the ordeals in which these ordeals are things in which human beings exhibit themselves as worthless in their natural existence, but ones they cannot convert into the positive apprehension of the absolute. Mm-hmm. So they're only ever getting a negative apprehension of the absolute.
Yeah.
The absolute as that which is got at by negating themselves.
Yeah.
They never sort of get to hold on to it. They're always sort of, by moving towards it, they're actually moving away from it, which is, I guess, the tragedy of it.
Which itself is very spiritual, right? Because
very spiritual.
Only a spiritual being could do such a thing. Only a being with freedom can negate that freedom.
Exactly, yeah. It's just that the freedom is not fully explicit yet. That's really the problem.
Well, these are the riddles of self-consciousness, right? That you kind of need to put yourself in front of yourself and be in your own way in order to grow, push yourself aside and grow from it. Yeah. So now I think we're maybe getting a richer sense of what Hegel meant with the spiritual substantiality. Because what we see here in this account that Hegel gives of ancient Indian religion, right? This is based on information he had available to him at his time and the kind of conceptual structures he extracted from it, is viewing the world in either, where you have a complete identity between nature and spirit, or a complete difference between nature and spirit.
Yeah, exactly.
But
even that complete difference,
as you were saying earlier, Ahilleas, really this is just the same difference, because significantly it's the same thing, and that's why it belongs together in this religion. It's not a paradox or a coincidence that these two seemingly diametrically opposed trends appeared here, when in reality they're really the same movement.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right. But at the same time, though, also the mere fact that they have these two different aspects, I would imagine that would be part of the path that takes the logic further.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. They are sharpening the extremes, they're sharpening the distinctions.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
And this is then this is why it's possible to have speculative insight, is because of these extremes, or the extreme is brought to such a point where you can have these speculative intimations, whereas you wouldn't have the same level in ancient Chinese religion as we saw earlier.
That's right. Yeah. So I think this was a really good section also for us to get a better grasp of this idea of ancient India as a land of subjectivity, as the land of fantasy, as he says. I think it's very clear what he has in mind, maybe a bit more clear than what we saw in earlier chapters when we talked about civil legislation and whatnot.
Yeah.
In this one in particular, it really comes to the fore what is at stake and why he identifies it as sort of the land of dreaming subjectivity.
Yes. And what is at stake is that the closer you move to the truth in this structure, in this logical context, the further you are away from it.
Exactly, yeah.
As you said, tragic.
It's almost tragic, yeah. But yeah, and I think that's all, right?
Yeah, I think we can cap it there.
Yeah.
It's a good session.
And next week we'll be talking about the state and its history.
Yes, indeed.
So I wonder how that will go. Okay, then. Well, then that's all from us.
That's all from us.
Leave your comments, questions, criticisms, disagreements, praises in the bar below, and we look forward to seeing what you have to say.
Yeah. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Have a good one.
Bye.